How y'all doing? We awake? Okay, great. I do a lot of teaching, so I'm very used to people asking questions. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. You're not going to trip me up. I love it. It's great. If you want to wait till the end, that's awesome too. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do, also why I do it. I'm actually going to start there and explain to some degree how my research has changed. I've always been interested in the effects of the environment on communities, started with plant communities, then got into plant pollinator communities. But it's become increasingly important to me in my work to do that to focus on environmental change, essentially. Because we are moving into, maybe not. No, it was working. And you know what? I was sitting the wrong way. We're good. All right. We are entering a new geologic era called the Anthropocene. Raise your hand if you ever heard of that term. Yeah, handfuls do. So it's this idea that we are moving into a whole different geologic era because we as a species are no longer just impacting the ecology, which we've done for as long as we've existed, right? We're part of nature, we're part of those communities, we've been influencing them. But we have such a large impact that's different than anything before us that we're actually changing the geologic record. So if you were to come back millions of years later, as an alien, whomever else, to look at our stripe, the actual fossilized soils, you would not see a different stripe, a stripe that is defined by us, because we do kinds of things to the environment. Those things are helping us feed our families and with these lives, but they're also having these consequences. This is a figure that I showed for some reason. So this is that there's a negative trend. First, this line is going down. This is insect violence at one show in Germany. This is a stark decline. There's about 75% decline in total biomass since 1989. That's concerning. That is really, really large, right? That's a big decline. And we're not seeing declines like that absolutely everywhere. I don't want to fear completely. But when you look at different species, this is a review paper that I'm showing you right here. So here is the state of species. We're seeing 40% of species. All right. The other thing you should know is how the boxes come down. Insects sometimes they have these cycles where they have good years and bad years. Part of what makes the bad years is the local environment. And unlike a lot of the things that we in this Anthropocene, where we have these really large scale challenges, things like climate change that are global, right? Sometimes we can't have an impact because those systems are so big and so large and it's hard to change them. But with insects, a lot of them do period and populations to be doing. So that means we actually make changes as individuals. So we can make changes that will help insects. So that's the story. We actually started with climate change. I still do climate change related research. It's been a little bit more empowering. I've spent with people who are not researchers, who are not academics, who are not in my classes. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that's really enjoyable work as well. All right, so we have these insects. They're declining, and these are flying insects. That's how they collect. It depends on how you collect the data, what kinds of insects you get. In this case, they were looking at flying insects. And those flying insects and insects in general do all kinds of things for us. Pollination, yes, I'm going to get there. I'm going to talk about them. That's my expertise. But they do all kinds of things too, right? They break detritus, dead stuff, including feces, right? Beetles. Anybody ever heard of beetles? Did you know that it was a dead beetle? Yes, indeed. Cool. So what they do is they take little chunks of feces and they roll them into a ball, and then they lay the larvae on top of it. The larvae grow in those feces. So what the best is all everybody for their use, of course, but it's also when the process breaks down. That right? We don't put that around. We need to put that because we have our own waste, right? We're not handling the rest of the world's waste. They also act as food, like birds, right? Anybody have animals? Yeah. Um, there's like aging and birding, and how like all of a sudden you're birding and you realize like birds are cool. Birds are cool. This is just really pattern. Seeing anyway, it's so cool. If you're a birder. But they're kind of cool, right? So including bats and lots of other things. Let's see what else. They also they bring us wonder. So this image tips any I don't have a pointer. But that top right insect, the second one over, anybody know what that is? A what? Not a ladybug. Lightning. Yes, it's a lightning. So a lot of these things actually bring wonder to our world. Within my lifetime, that lightning bugs are a lot less abundant than they used to be, unless you have a area that doesn't remove leaves in the fall. There's a prairie by my kid's school, and it's intentional niche so that it's low maintenance, right? So that means they don't remove any of the vegetation. And a ton of these guys nest over winter and they grow in that dead material, that leafy material. And man, summers, when you drive by at like 9:30 at night, it's magical, right? So a lot of these things bring us a lot of joy and magic as well. The insects that kind of get the most hype are butterflies, right? Monarchs, we hear a lot about monarchs, but other really showy organisms that are really beautiful. But all of these organisms, whether or not they're beautiful or they bring us on, are also because of ecosystem services. We are of the pollinators. When we first think about pollinators, we usually think about bees. We are going to talk about bees. That is my expertise. We're going to talk a little bit about another group of pollinators that's really important, which are flies. Because it turns out that yes, bees are important, but lots of other pollinators are important too. So up here we have, I'm going to put my hand the flower fly right here, which is in the second hand. We also have another fly right here. This is I don't think so. In particular gets married, right? Has anyone been stung by this? I have, right? And oftentimes it's when we're actually like either mowing a lawn or on a deck or there's or something nearby. And but there are a ton of species. In North America, there's like 20,000 species of wasps in North America alone, and most of them you've probably never seen or paid attention to because us, right? They're not engaging us, they don't care about us, and they're also really important pollinators. And then there's our butterflies, our millions down here are also really important pollinators. They each pollinate different kinds of plants. There's of course overlap, but they have preferences. And those preferences become important and that diversity becomes important because they support 87% of all flowering plants. The biggest group of plants on Earth. And they are everywhere, obviously. And most of our plants come from this group as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second too. So if we species that are on Earth, and multiply that by the percent number that require animal pollination, that gives us about 308,000 species of plants, right? Including a lot of our native plants that I'm showing here in a bunch of different habitats. These are all pictures that were taken in Missouri, including one from Central Library. If anybody's ever been to Central Library, so it can, there are of course in natural areas as well. But it's also important, of course, for the things that we eat, right? Now, we have raw calories from things that are manipulated. We get a lot of that from rice, wheat, anything from the grass family, right? And that's mostly been pollinated. All the insects do still visit them and will move some pollen. But the majority of the nutrition comes from animal pollinated plants. And I'm just showing you blueberries, blackberries, tomatoes, almonds, coffee, chocolate, all of those things require pollination. All right. And you have a full seed. And that's important not only for us to eat, but it's also important because people make their living off of these things, right? You think about some of the issues that we've had with well, has anybody even heard about the peanut challenges? There's certain peanuts crops that have been really decimated this past year because of local weather, where like they had really, really bad monsoons that wiped out a bunch of peanuts, and that's actually increasing peanut butter prices. Anyway, so those are the kinds of reasons why this is important, both from the ecological side, but also from the human side, right? Because we rely on it for nutrition and many people for their income also. All right. We've known about declines, particularly with bees. They was one of the first ones that we saw it for a while. This is actually a Time magazine cover from 2014. So scientists know that it's been decades that we've been documenting some of these challenges. Now, we started with the biggest media coverage was for honeybees because we use them agriculturally, right? We moved it and we have this monoculture system. And you have a lot of honeybees at one time. Does anybody know how many honeybees we have? Want to give ganders? Anything? How many individuals do you think are a given hive? Any shoot out.
500,000.
But 40,000. You can get 40,000 individual bees in one hive that's like this, which is, but they're not actually the creative pollinators. We use them a lot because we can get a lot of them at once, but they can't pollinate everything. They're pollinating some things. So, and the things that say bees is very than the other 2,000 species of bees in the world. Within, there's like 4,000 species of bees. Within 450, within the over 2 species of bees. Minus half of the entire state, which is pretty cool. We've bee diversity, and that's a strength, right? That's a strength because that helps us pollinate a lot of our fruit crops. So the scary thing, though, is that 1 in 5 of those are threatened by extinction as well. It's not just honeybees that we need to worry about. We need to worry about all these other ones because, again, that diversity matters. And I'll explain a little bit more why that diversity matters. Part of that is because they perceive and interact with the world in a really different way. What I'm showing you here is just comparing human views versus bee views. And this is for honeybees because we really have the best understanding of their vision than other species, although there's variation in bee species. So if you we have 5 different species of flowers here, and you take a picture with a regular camera that is sensitive to the lights that our eyes can see, the wavelengths that our eyes can see, it looks one way. But bees don't see the way that we do. They can't really see red very well, and they can see in UV. So that third column is showing its false color, meaning we've put on our own color scheme onto it because we can't see UV. But this is what it would look like roughly to a bee, and it looks very, very different, right? Birds see different things. Birds are pollinators too. Bats are pollinators too. All of those different groups perceive the world in a different way. Cool little story about this, why I have a picture of a human up here when I'm talking about bee vision. So Charles Henry Turner is actually really probably I would argue, at least from my field, the most famous scientist from St. Louis, at least for my field, for sure. Because he did a lot of the early work on honeybee vision. He was one of the first people to identify that honeybees can't see red. And that's something that's just sort of established now that's been tested several times. And he worked at Sumner High School. So he did some of this work when he was teaching high school, which let me tell you, teaching at an undergraduate level institution and doing research is a challenge. And only imagine what it is like when you're full-time as a high school teacher and then trying to publish things as he successfully did. So that's kind of a cool local story there. All right, so they perceive the world differently. They interact with the world differently. Going back to these blueberries and tomatoes, 2 of my favorite foods, they are buzz pollinated or sonicated. And that means that the pollinator has to grab the flower and shake it at the right frequency or pitch in order to get pollen out of it. Honeybees can't do it. Bumblebees can, blueberry bees can, and some sweet bees can. The reason why most species don't do it is because they don't have this adaptation. There's this really cool adaptation. I'm going to show it in a second of buzz pollination, but they essentially pylorus. It's their wings from the thorax, and those thorax is where they have those big muscles, those big flight muscles, and that's what makes them vibrate. So you can't what's going to happen. You're moving muscles, so your wings, right? So not all species have this adaptation to unhook those wings so that buzz, but not fly. All right. So what I want you to do, I'm not going to say, and what I want you to do is, there will be a narrator. She has good things to say. Listen to her. We pay close attention to the pitch or the sound that the bee makes when she's visiting the flowers.
This buzzing is a secret password, the key to a lock. What this bumblebee is after is pollen. Bumblebees eat pollen. It's high in protein. But the flower doesn't want to give it to just anyone, so it hides it away in those bright yellow anthers. For a flower, that's unusual. Most flowers keep their pollen on the outside of the anther, which is the male part of the flower. Pollen is basically sperm for plants. Most flowers make sugary nectar too. They use it as bait to attract bees and other pollinators, which get coated in pollen along the way. And since bees are messy, they inadvertently scatter some of that pollen onto the female part of the next flower they visit. That's how most flowers have sex. But this type of flower doesn't offer nectar. The only way to get to its pollen is through those tiny pores at the ends. But the bumblebee knows just what to do. It wraps its legs around the flower and bites down on the anthers, that male part of the flower. See those wings shaking? Normally, the bumblebee uses those powerful muscles to flap its wings. That's what makes the buzzing sound when they fly.
All right, so did you hear that difference? Apologies for the buffering. We had some connectivity issues, so I had to join in through my phone via internet. But did you hear those differences in the buzzes, right? It starts off when she's flying, and it's like a bzzz, it's a lower note, right? And then when she gets to the flower, she buzzes at a higher pitch, zzz, 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 right? And it's different the way that she does it. They tend to do it in short bursts in order to get that pollen dislodged. So these declines have gotten so bad that in parts of the world, we are hand pollinating plants. Raise your hand if you have ever had to hand pollinate a plant. Okay, is it tedious? No, it's really tedious. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of manpower. Frankly, we're not very good at it. So this man is in an apple orchard, and he is climbed up into that tree on the end of that long bamboo stick. He has what looks like a fuzzy sponge, right? He's taking that sponge, he's dipping it in pollen, and he's literally going through and pollinating flowers with that sponge, right? That would be a wicked job, right? Respect to this human. That is not easy, right? But that's how desperate we are in some locations. In order to increase yield, in order to make money out of these orchards and to feed people, we're having to sort of foot the bill that our pollinators no longer are. We are also coming up with increasingly creative ways, such as with drone technology. This is just one example. I'll show a short clip of this video too.
These little creatures help us grow fresh fruits and vegetables. But did you imagine that these little drones can also do the work of bees? Polybee is building nano drones to automate pollination and yield forecasting to change the future of farming. Pollination is the process where pollen is transferred from a male part to the female part of a flower. Natural pollinators contribute to up to 80% of global food production. In the absence of natural pollinators in indoor farms, pollination has to be done manually. It's expensive and inefficient. The populations of natural pollinators are also threatened by climate change and pesticides. We have built autonomous nano drones, such as this one, to pollinate flowers. And just like bees, what they do is find flowers hover on the top of them, vibrate them with the airflow just like bees would. And that's exactly how pollen grains are dislodged. And this is how a flower turns into a big juicy fruit.
So some things are wind pollinated, and some things that are generally animal pollinated can be pollinated okay or better with drones because it moves that air. And if it's enough to move the air, to move the pollen, then they can. Obviously, those buzz pollinated things, that's not going to work for. But this is where we're at in terms of our desperation, right? So it isn't just in China that we're seeing, which is where that original image 2 slides ago was from, where we're seeing declines in insects that can influence production. We also see pollen limitation in urban orchards. And this work comes out of the Cracus lab here at Maryville, where they are actually demonstrating that in our orchards here within St. Louis, we have pollen limitation. How do they do that? A really cool way, actually. So you go to a tree and you tag 2 flowers next to each other. One of them you leave open, right? You just let insects come and visit it and pollinate. You don't do anything else to it except for track it. Then you take another flower nearby and you put as much pollen on there as you possibly can. You just douse it, right? And then you track the pollen tube growth all the way down to the ovary. So that can tell you, by comparing these two, it tells us whether or not the flower is getting as much pollen as it could possibly need to produce fruit. And it's not only like, does it produce fruit, does it not produce fruit? The more pollen it gets, the more high quality pollen it gets, the larger the fruits are, the more seeds you can get out of it, right? And if you increase the diversity of the pollinators, that increases pollen transfer. So here are 2 images that her group took, but then if we look at it across all of the locations, we see something similar. So our open flowers have many, many fewer tubes that are grown compared to our supplemented flowers. So this is a widespread issue. It's an issue here within our own community. What's causing pollinator declines? You know, these are, how many species did I say there were? Just 20,000 species of bees alone, right? So this is a big issue. There are lots of things that are potentially influencing these declines. It could be introduced species, deforestation, climate change, right? All kinds of things when you're talking globally can influence insect declines. So how do we understand or respond to those impacts? Well, we have to look a little bit closer and look at specific systems and make predictions within those specific systems and then make changes, right? And that's where my lab comes in. So we have 3 main goals in my lab. The first is to understand how environmental changes affect pollinators. The second one is to try to contribute to our understanding of best practices for conserving them, right? So what are the things that we can do within our system to actually increase pollinators? And the third one is to get outside of our ivory tower and collaborate with people who are actually on the ground doing the conservation work and who maybe aren't as familiar with some of this stuff as I am. So I'm going to tell you little snippets of each of these that my students have contributed to. I have pictures of a bunch of different students here that have contributed to the research that's done here. I'm not going to name all of them, but I at least wanted to put their smiling faces up here so you get a sense for the number of folks that go into this work. I will highlight a few students who did senior theses work because they really took the lead on those particular projects. All right, so for our first question, how does environmental change affect pollinators? As I mentioned, this is going to be different depending on where you are, what system you are. So we're focused here in St. Louis, primarily looking at the effects of urbanization on plant pollinator interactions and bees in particular. So we're working in the same orchards that Dr. Cracus is working in, but we're doing the bee side of stuff, the pollinator side of stuff, right? So whereas her lab group is really focused on the plant side of things, together we're looking at the interactions on both sides, but my group is focused in on the pollinator diversity, behavior, all that kind of stuff. So we go out to 18 different sites about every 7 to 10 days, and we net all the insects we possibly can that are on these trees. So we go out, any tree that's blooming, we just take an aerial sweep net and collect everything that's on there. It doesn't matter if it's a bee, a fly, a wasp, a beetle, if it's there, we're collecting it. Then we bring those back to the lab and we identify them. The data that I'm going to show you today are from Emma Da Silva's work. She graduated 2 springs ago now, and she demonstrated a really interesting pattern. Before I show you that pattern, though, I'm going to preface something. When we say that urbanization is an issue for pollinators, we're often thinking of really, really big cities like New York City. When you're talking moderate amounts of urbanization compared to rural areas, so farmland where it's like monoculture, you actually see higher biodiversity in the city, all right? So along urbanization gradients, we generally actually see an increase in species richness of bees, all right? Did you track that? Give me your thumbs on how well you tracked what I just said. Okay, cool. So it's counterintuitive. We think urbanization is bad, but for bees in particular, it might not be that bad, all right? So we saw a decline. We saw a negative relationship. So in more urbanized environments, we saw reduced diversity. Again, be that statistic, but the last couple decades, or not a couple decades, I'm sorry, like 5 or so years, you would be a little surprised. This is a surprising finding. Now, we see a lot, a different time of year. So many of the studies that I mentioned before are really done in the summer. Ours is done in the spring. What's blooming in the spring? When you think about spring and you think about the first flowers that you're going to see, you might think about like a spring beauty or a crocus, right? Or trees, redbuds, lindera, it's a bush, dogwoods, right? So a lot of our pollen resources at this time of year are in trees and in bushes, and we have less of those in the urban environment. So that explains why we see a different pattern in the spring than in the summer. And this gets back to this idea of why heterogeneity, having different patches of land, doing different patches of things, is important. But this isn't the whole of the story. So George Todd, who is a master's or PhD student, excuse me, at UMSL, is a specialist in flies, and he was really interested in looking at flies in particular. And what he found was the opposite. So fly activity increases in urban environments. So if you take those 2 things together, the big takeaway there is that in the city, flies are really important pollinators. We think of bees, we prioritize bees. Bees are important, but they're not always important. All right, so if you were to describe the weather in St. Louis as a spring, what are some more words that you would use? Humid. What else? Think spring, April, March. Rainy, overcast, cool. Yep.
Tornadoes.
Tornadoes. We can get those in the summer too. But still, you know, it starts getting a little nasty. We get some bigger storms. Bees don't like to fly on those conditions. Flies, however, are stronger flyers, and they are willing to do it. So they're in the city, they're important in the spring because they're willing to fly and be active when the bees are there. Okay. We are also interested in how those pollinators are behaving. Remember, I showed those videos of sonication, and I showed, well, that's the only video I really showed of sonication, right? Some bees behave differently on flowers than other bees. Well, there's a bunch of different behaviors that they do, not just buzzing. I'm showing a list here. I have one highlighted, which we'll come to in a second. So in order to look at behavior, what we did is we put out video cameras, literally just camcorders like you'd have at home. We strap them to the branch of a tree, and we let them record a patch of flowers until the battery dies. It tends to be about 2 hours because you want to get as much time as you possibly can. Has anybody ever sat and watched a flower to see how frequently it's visited? It's not very frequent. You got to watch for a while. So the videos have to run for a long period of time, which means we can watch that video and annotate when and where these pollinators are visiting, and then all right, which is head side PER. What the heck does that mean? PER stands for proboscis extension reflex. What that really means is they're sticking their tongue out trying to get nectar. All right. What head side means is that they're coming in with their head on the side of the flower. Now, envision a flower Are the reproductive parts on the side of the flower usually? At the base? No, they're at the top, okay? So the next to that, head central PER, is where the pollinator actually lands on top of the flower, lands on the stigma, lands on the stamen, and therefore it's better for pollination. All right, I'm gonna show one last video here. And I'm gonna slow this video down, hopefully, so that you can see at her head is down in the center of the flower, right? So when she landed, she hit the stamen and she hit the stigma, potentially pollinating the plant, all right? Versus head side, they won't result in pollination. So again, lots going on here, focusing on that pink. In the exurban and in the urban environments, about 10% of the time, bees are flying in and they're not pollinating. They're nectaring. They're stealing, right? They're not doing. But in the urban environments in the cities, they're less likely to do that. Why? We do now. But from the perspective, this pollinators, at least for this particular one. Because purple is the, that's where they're on the stigma, right? And we see that more frequently in the city. So what's the size difference for the production of the orchard and how much food they can actually get out of it and share with their communities? We don't know. That's going to be really so that is coming, but we don't really quite have the answer to that yet. All right, on to our second main goal, which is to determine best practices for conserving pollinators. For this project, I collaborated with Nina Fogel, who was a graduate student at SLU for this project, but now is working for the Missouri Department of Conservation. We this project. This is where experts in the field to conduct a research study. In all cases, what folks were using was infecting bees, right? They had to choose a garden of their choice. Sometimes it was their backyard, sometimes it was a park garden, sometimes it was an orchard, community garden. They got to choose. Over 4 years, we had 304 people who contributed at least one picture and over 52,000 observations in 4 years. That is the amount of data that we would never have been able to get without that collaboration, without working with people on the ground, right? Because they went out every 2 weeks for the entirety of the growing season and photographed bees. We also spatial scale than we ever would have had time to collect data ourselves, right? To look into the St. Louis region. So they naturalist, we identified them, and then this is where the fun part starts coming. I mean, this one actually, but this is where we get some results. I'm going to show you. This is actually a 3 students who had as we went along, because we were using a modeling approach to try to predict where we're going to see a bee and why we might see it in a particular garden. So that sometimes that takes time. Computational stuff can take some time. So Evelyn Pereiro, Colby Kent, and Jason were all students in my lab who worked on this, in collaboration with Adam Smith at the Missouri Department of Conservation. And right now, Jason and I are actually writing this up. We're hoping to submit it by the end of the semester. All right, so let me first show you, before you read, try to read and interpret this massive table thing that we have here, figure. I want to help you. So you see that dash line in the middle, that 0 line? That means that in this case, urbanization does not matter to that bee. They're not making decisions about whether or not they're in a garden based off of how much concrete there is in the area. All right. If that line is on the right of it, or if the species line is on the right of it, of that dash line, then that means that positively associated with habitat complexity. I mean, urbanization. So the more urban, the more likely you are to find that be there. All right. If you're on the other side, then the less likely you are to see that species there. Right. Now, there's like hundreds of colors. I want you to focus on the darker green colors, the two darker green colors, because those are the ones that we actually have confidence that there's a pattern. Everything else, the green and the green, there's probably no pattern. So what do you notice here? For most of the species, are they dark green? No. No. They're gray or light green. Meaning they don't really care. They're not in a garden. They're not more likely to find a bee in of a certain species in a city garden versus a suburban garden. All right, which is a little surprising because we had seen these really dramatic patterns of diversity, bee diversity across that urbanization gradient. Okay, well, another prevailing idea in the literature is that it has to do with the flowers. Plant it and they will come, they say, right? Increase your flowering diversity, you're going to get more bees. No, not for these species, not in our system, right? We have 3 species that are a little bit more likely to occur in flower-rich environments, but for the most part, species richness doesn't matter either. What does matter for the vast majority of species is habitat complexity. And this is something that hadn't been seen that much in the literature. There's only a couple papers that have come out over the last year or two that demonstrate similar things. What the heck is habitat complexity? Well, you can kind of understand it intuitively if you think about gardens, right? A low complexity garden is one that's highly maintained. It's predominantly lawn. It has beds, flower beds that are kind of far apart, and they're really well manicured. Vegetation is cut back in the spring and the fall. Leaves are likely removed. Right? A higher complexity environment, it's messier. You have more canopy layers. So yes, you have your grasses and your forbs growing, but you also have bushes and you have trees and you have more complex landscapes in terms of your beds. The beds are connected to each other. You have less lawn, right? It's a messier, wilder environment. And for most species, the most predicted factor was habitat complexity.
Yeah. Have you done any, I'm taking it as there's less bees in the highly managed one because they have somehow, they know that there's going to be lawn tools and people taking care of those. So they don't want to be in it. Have you done any with 2 messy gardens where you have people coming to maintain it?
Yeah, no, we haven't because this is new, right? And this is not something we've had a chance to follow up on. Personally, I think it is less about them making a decision or whether they actively see humans out there. They don't really care about us. They don't actively hide from us.
Well, not necessarily humans, but if they know that something's being cut down, they're gonna.
It's more that they'll go to the resources, right? So if you have a complex habitat, you have lots of different kinds of nesting sites, you have lots of different kinds of forage, you have flowers that are blooming throughout the whole season. So my hunch, I'm not saying that it's impossible what you're hypothesizing, but I'm saying my hunch is that it's probably more resource-based than it is interaction with it. Although it's not impossible. Bees, at least honeybees, it's been shown that they can learn faces. They learn faces of their keepers and stuff like that. All right, so to actually making decisions, right? To garden clubs, to municipalities to talk about how these kinds of structures are really important for biodiversity. And we can start doing that outside of our ivory walls, as I mentioned. And that leads to my next one, which is collaborating with non-academics to actually see if we can make some changes. And for that, I'm going to return to the citizen science project, Shutterbee. There are a lot of programs out there that are encouraging folks to re-envision how we use our land and to think of ourselves more stewards of biodiversity rather than a lawn being an extension of our living room, right? So there's all kinds of organizations that have done this. We are not the first to be thinking of it this way. But there's more resistance because these kinds of changes are influenced by aesthetic and decisions that people are making, right? In their gardens that are based off of cultural aesthetics on part, but then also learning how to garden with natives is very different than gardening with cultivated species. We've literally bred cultivated species to do what we want them to do. Wild species do what they want to do. They don't care about this, right? They're doing their own things and doing their own things. And there was a study that came out a couple of years ago now that actually tested this, that asked people, what would stop you from working with natives, or what has stopped you from working with natives? There's a lot of information on here. I have color coded the big ones into those two main areas: aesthetic, cultural barriers, and knowledge-based barriers. And you can see the majority of the responses can be pooled into those two things. So with the Shutterbee program, one of the things we were hoping to do was to, yes, we had ecological questions. We wanted to understand how diversity changed throughout the organization gradient, but we also wanted to work individually with people who were making decisions on the ground. We wanted to learn from them, and we wanted to see whether or not learning about those bees, learning about the ways that we can help them, actually changed how connected they felt to those organisms, and therefore whether they were likely to engage in conservation activities to support them. So we did last year in 2020 was the first year of Shutterbee, and we asked our peers after they had been participating in the program for about most of them about 4 or 5 months to rank their well, not really rank. There's a certain set of survey questions that they are asked. They're Likert scales. Anybody heard of Likert scale? They go from 0 to or 1 to 7, right? And you rank your feelings about X, Y, Z. Well, there are some established surveys that use that approach, and one of them is the environmental identity score. What that measures is how much of your individual identity is tied to your feelings about nature. Okay, so we asked them a series of questions that allowed us to summarize that. All of our participants obviously were in Shutterbee. About half of them were also in Bring Conservation Home, which is a different kind of conservation program that basically says, comes to your garden and says, hey, get rid of these invasive species, plant some stuff here, do very specific things for biodiversity, right? So that's a very different kind of program. And it turns out it doesn't really matter which program they're in. By being outside and engaging with these organisms in the field, we saw an increase in environmental identity. You might notice on the right, on the left, those folks that were in both programs have a higher environmental identity to begin with. That's not too surprising. These are both pretty high barrier programs, so you're only going to do them if you're already pretty devoted to it. But the change that we saw was across the board. It didn't matter what programs they were in. Now, you might be looking at that percent increase, right? 1.75, 2%. That doesn't seem like that much. It didn't seem like that much to me as an ecologist. But I'm not a psychologist, and I vividly remember being on a Zoom meeting with my collaborator, Erin Tate from the zoo, talking about this, and her face was like, no, 2% change in your identity. We're not talking like, oh, I just kind of like this. I like this plant. I like that bee. No, your identity, how you define yourself, and how closely you define yourself in relation to nature. That's a big change, which is pretty exciting. One of the more exciting things for me, because I wanted to know whether or not maybe you're only going to see big changes if you're seeing big diversity, right? So are folks who are already in habitats that have greater biodiversity, are they more likely to see change? Or are you going to be able to see change in individuals who are only of a few species, right? Maybe they don't think about these organisms. Maybe they're in an area that has low biodiversity for whatever reason. On the x-axis is change in environmental identity. On the y-axis is number of taxa observed. Oh, it's inverted. I'm sorry. On the x-axis, it's the amount of species observed. On the y-axis is change in environmental identity. It doesn't matter. There's no relationship. That's exciting. That's wherever people are, if they're just starting to look at maybe they're only noticing honeybees and bumblebees or carpenter bees, they're learning more than they knew before, and that's still connecting them with more connecting them with nature and making them more likely to make conservation changes or decisions that are aligned with supporting these organisms. All right, so what have we learned so far? at least that I've told you about today, that flies are important city pollinators for various reasons. They could be really important, particularly for fruit production. Complex gardens are a conservation target, right? They are the best predictor of majority of species, whether or not they're likely to be in a garden. And in terms of making cultural shifts, making aesthetic shifts, it doesn't matter if you're starting with a really highly diverse area or not. If you're engaging with the natural world, it's potentially changing your environmental identity, which is pretty amazing. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people to thank, as well as funding sources. And I left a little bit of time for questions. If you have them, I'll leave you with a pretty picture of this adorable masked bee. Thank you.
What should we do about like our animals? Like, so we can't, I'm always telling my parents like, oh, we should be more biodiverse. But if we bring bees and my dog tries to eat them, and so like, how do I increase biodiversity in our lawns without like, and she's anaphylaxis to bees, so like we have to be extra.
She's highly allergic.
She's highly loves eating them. So like, what should we do to increase biodiversity and also support our planet?
So maybe you don't focus on bees for your particular setting, right? That's my area of expertise. But birds are also really important. And so I mean, any organism, it doesn't have to be bees that you're choosing to garden for. You could choose a different set, right? Something that's not going to potentially kill your dog, right? And then, dogs don't live forever. You move on, you have new pets later. You can think about adding bees later, right? But maybe take a small piece, right? You can't solve all the things. Just take one small piece to make you feel like you are contributing, because you are, right? So that would be my recommendation. Thank you all for listening. Have a good rest of your Thursday.